Okay.
Hi, I'm Luke Harris. I work as a book designer, and I've been designing book covers for maybe 20 years or so. And I've recently designed, a number of books for Trevor Hay, a local author. And we're just going to discuss a little bit of the process involved in putting together a book cover, and the kind of things that Trevor's after when he engages me to design a cover. So, over to Trevor.
Well, I'm the person who designs what's between the covers, and Luke and I have a very good understanding in that quite often my subjects are rather exotic, and I draw on sources that I've collected over many years, and when I have an idea for a book, I frequently send Luke pictures which he then organises in a way that comes out as a book cover, and always reflects really what I want the book to say about itself.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of the things that Trevor writes about are things that I'm personally interested in, so that always brings a bit more to the process if you can get engaged on that sort of level. It's intellectually very interesting, and Trevor's writing is very sophisticated, so when you have an opportunity to work on books like that with a literary value, it's much more of an entertaining sort of process. And Trevor always comes up with interesting themes, and it's pictorially and visually very interesting to work on those sort of covers, and he appreciates that kind of, putting an extra bit of effort into the design process.
Yeah, well, I suppose perhaps we could give an example of how that works. If we can see the cover on this one, my latest book, there's a strange looking bird which is sort of an owl or sort of a kite, and it's taken from a Japanese 19th century lithograph, and it depicts a creature that's very widespread in both ancient and modern Japanese and Chinese mythology. I say modern because in the manga and anime forms this creature still appears, but he appears as a dog, so he can change shapes. My reason for picking him as an illustration is that he's partly immortal, well, partly godlike. He has strange powers, more powers than humans, but he also has limitations, and so he's frequently in a situation where he's trapped between heaven and earth, which is really what I wanted to say in the book, which is why the cover is like that, with the bird stuck in the middle of heaven and earth.
Yeah, and trying to integrate the what's an Eastern mythological figure into an Australian framework is very interesting as well. Somehow, sort of making those harmonise together, and Trevor was keen to make that happen with the eucalyptus leaves and the fire at the bottom and the local. So somehow making those two work together was an interesting design challenge.
In fact, this is the crazy part about the way way I work, probably the way a lot of people work, but I actually went round my neighbourhood looking for leaves. You wouldn't think there'd be any shortage of leaves in Eltham, but I wanted exactly the right leaves, and if you look carefully at the cover, you see that they mimic the shape of the samurai sword that the bird is carrying, and so there's a sense of threat about them, and also they're above a burning situation, because the book was written at a time when the bushfires were on us, and I wanted to capture that idea of a contemporary crisis.
And there were a lot of iterations of this cover, a lot of versions of it back and forth. That's part of the process. When you work directly with an author, it's sort of different than working with a publisher. You get a lot more customizing of the final result to the author's taste, whereas in a typical publishing situation, the author doesn't get much of a say in it at all. So it's nice to know that the author's happy with the final result, and it's not something foisted upon them by the publisher. So that part of the process was very, very positive.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And in earlier books that I wrote in the 1990s, I didn't have much say at all about the cover. And you're always thrilled when it comes back from the publisher, but it's not the same as being able to put into the cover what you think the book's about, and that's been the most wonderful thing. A partnership where you can work back and forwards with these ideas, and ultimately, although I have the sort of a visual image in my head, I have no idea in the end how or if that can work until Luke arranges things.
Yeah, no, I am appreciative that Trevor's creating a kind of mythical Eltham. He's actually working on depictions of Eltham at the moment that are interesting and fresh, and carrying on a tradition of a literary and artistic tradition of Eltham creators. So I do appreciate that part of it with Trevor.
And in fact, for reasons that I can't explain here, there are illustrations that are very Eltham inside this book, which is ostensibly about Oriental mythology. Well, it's not about Oriental mythology, but as a theme. However, I also managed to get Alan Marshall's statue by Marcus Skipper into the plot, and so we've got quite a nice picture of that statue outside the Eltham Library, which people should go and look at. It's a lovely statue.
It is. And I've enjoyed reading about, through Trevor's work, a lot of material about Montsalvat and the early sort of artistic history of Eltham as well. So it's fun bringing that into it.
Not to mention the contribution of the Eltham bookshop era to the cultural life of Eltham.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a long back list of Trevor's work now. So it's not just the latest one. He's got a whole series of interesting books that touch on these sort of themes.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about some of the materials that you use to bring these covers to life?
Yeah, sure. Well, in this one, there are some lovely old prints, artistic, prints that are in the public domain, that may be, in some cases a couple of centuries old. So you have access to those sort of things, and there's archival images of Eltham, Trevor's leaves that we've been scanning, and some of the other books have used that kind of combination of things as well. But if you get a chance to use historical prints, that's always, there's some beautiful work there. So half the design work's done when you're able to use that kind of material. I always enjoy covers that work on that sort of level.
In fact, there's several of those. This one, the picture in the cover, is from a 19th century lithograph by Hokusai, a Japanese artist that everyone knows for his picture of the blue wave.
Yeah, that's right. The views of Fuji. He did it. I can't remember how many views of Fuji he did, but it was a lot.
So his illustrations were once used for a much older version of a Chinese collection of ghost stories, and so I took that picture, and then associated it with a translation of a Japanese folk story written much later. There are other Australian things in there. For example, there's a Bronowski lithograph print of the first depiction of the powerful owl which lives in this area. And I managed to get a copy of that print from an antique maps and prints shop, and use it in the text. So it's hard to explain here, but the book is about a group of people who meet in Eltham, a Chinese family and a local man who meet and tell ghost stories. And so they swap stories about their mythologies, their fears, what works as a fearful thing in one culture but not in another, what is taboo in one culture and not in another. And in the process they reveal Some of the things are just fun, scary for telling ghost stories, and some things, which I call ordinary terrors, as in the subtitle, are the real terrors of life, such as we have, disease and war and famine and all the horrible things that beset us at the moment.
So, also look at the cover and I think of the color palette. Who decides that?
Well, that went through a few iterations. It ended up having that nice sort of range of burnt hues, but I think that was Trevor that drove the fire and the sort of, and the little splashes of blood as well.
Splashes of blood.
That was an important part. That came more into it as we went along. And it became more intense, the colours, as we went along. It started out fairly washed out, I seem to remember, and then it worked its way into being a more, a higher contrast, more saturated colours, and I think it had a lot more impact as a result. But it was Trevor who sort of drove a lot of that.
So Luke, is this all on a software, or do you actually use mediums like paint and pencils?
Sometimes I do. Mostly just for reasons of time, because when you've got a lot of projects to work on, it'd be nice to do an original artwork for everything, but mostly it's photo collage and working with archival materials and so forth. So I would like to do more original art for these things, but that opens up a whole new kettle of fish really, because modifying those sort of things is much more time consuming. So mostly it's a layered collage in a program like Photoshop with the various source materials.
Trevor, when you are looking for an illustrator or a designer, I know that you have had a long relationship with Luke for all your books, The Secret of the Lunar Rainbow, The Letters from a Floating Life, all the innumerable books that you've done. Could you talk about, before you met Luke or found Luke or discovered Luke, what were you looking for? Who were you looking for?
Well, I didn't know I was looking for anybody. I wrote the first book was A Dream of Red Dragonflies, and I was fortunate enough to have a publisher who recommended Luke, and then that began the process straight away, because I was able to use two old unglazed antique statues that I had in my study, and an antique map, and I found that Luke responded to those things wonderfully well. I wasn't having to explain or justify. We just clicked. So I think it was just good luck.
And Luke, do you decide which books you're going to design, and can you say no?
I don't say no very often. When you're running a small business, it's more of a case of saying yes to most things. I don't know if I've knocked many things back. Sometimes things drag out, more than you'd like, but generally you try to make the best of any particular project that comes up. Some of them go very easily and reach a resolution pretty quickly, and others are much more difficult. The author doesn't have a clear idea of what they want, and they know what they don't want, but never know what they do want. But when you've worked on a few thousand of these covers, it becomes easier. But you do, each one carries a risk of failure, and you've really got to put a lot of work into each one. Nothing comes